The sun shone down as the wake trailed out on that cold November day, when she wrapped her cloak over ship and crew, when the winds began to roar. Every man aboard tightened down their souls, far from the Michigan shore. Mick sorely true telephoned the crew when the storm was setting in. Better hold on tight through this day and night of straight line killer winds. 44 years I have met these storms when nor'easter gales have blown. But oh, these mountains on Superior are the worst I've ever known. Who hears a prayer when the wind strikes down and the seas boil into foam? When the waves cap off and are blown away and you're miles away from home? Who hears a cry when the north wind roars and the crew are pitched to the rail, as the great ship rolls and the church She was there at the dock when the lines cast off and the Fitz got under.
Hey everybody, I'm here in the pilot house of the 1952 built classic steamer Arthur M. Anderson. So I'm going to
lives on from the Chippewa down of the big lake they call Gitchagumi. The lake, it is said, never gives up the dead when the skies in November turn gloomy. With the load of iron ore, 26,000 tons more, and the Edmund Fitzgerald weighed empty. That good ship and true, was it born to be chewed when the gales of November came burning? The ship was the pride of the American side.
The legend lives on from the Chippewa on down of the big lake they call Gitchagumi. The lake, it is said, never gives up her dead when the skies of November turn gloomy. With a load of iron ore, 26,000 tons more.
Today we are in Detroit, Michigan on Belle Isle visiting the Edmund Fitzgerald Memorial Anchor.
It looks from the information that we have that it's very certain that the Fitzgerald went down. And we're talking now about a matter of life and death and looking for survivors that might be in life rafts or in the water. I asked him how he was making out with his problem. He said he lost those vents and he had a lift, and he said he was holding his own. The last time I talked with him, he said he was holding his own, and that's the last time I lost contact after that.
After visiting the anchor, we decided to head into the Dawson Great Lakes Museum.
Lake Superior maps in there. Iowa.
Imagine doing that. Look at that, there's buttons over there. I can breathe.
That I know of that talks about Lake Superior, Gitche Gumee giving up its dead. But I did find out 150 years before we really started to see it on the Great Lakes, Lake Tahoe was the lake that never gives up its dead. It's too cold. And as I searched using a power search of give up its dead or lake that never gives up its dead, you start to turn up that in Wyoming when a banker died. And again, this is all 100 years before we start to see stuff attributed to Lake Superior on the lake. The dark lake never gives up its dead, it's too cold, and the stories.
This episode of History is brought to you by Riley, this week's news patron. The wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald was almost 50 years ago, and the tale is both extraordinary and heartbreaking, but there's more to the story than just her sinking. From the death of an onlooker when she crashed into the dock, the anchor she lost that we recovered long before we could ever reach the depths of her wreckage, to the heroic story of a ship that, despite the storm, went out of the safe harbor to find the Edmund Fitzgerald and try to save her crew. This week on History, the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. Hi, I'm Tim from History. We started this brand new channel a few weeks ago with back-to-back episodes on the Erie Canal, and then we did one on the disasters of Niagara Falls. It only seems right to follow that pattern into the Great Lakes and talk about the most famous shipwreck they've ever had, the Edmund Fitzgerald. If you like this video, please don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to this brand new channel. Those things are free for you, and they would really mean the world to me.
Welcome to the TV5 Vault. I'm Chris Eastlick. 46 years ago, the Edmund Fitzgerald sank in Lake Superior during a storm. But did you know a little over a year earlier, the Fitzgerald lost one of its 12,000-pound anchors in the Detroit River? In today's edition of the TV5 Vault, Rick Mixter takes us back to July of 1992 for the recovery of that anchor.
An often untold story of this famous shipwreck is the loss of one of its 12,000-pound anchors just months before it sunk. I was just 10 years old at the time, and I remember this as not only my introduction to a fascination with shipwrecks, but also with the Edmund Fitzgerald. I lived in Windsor at the time, right across from Detroit, and I got to watch this live in 1992 on TV and by looking out at the Detroit River. It was one of the first ever live news broadcasts from underwater.
It's hard to believe, but this piece of the Edmund Fitzgerald has been underwater longer than the actual ship has. That's because the anchor was accidentally dropped into the Detroit River just months before she sunk off Whitefish Point in Lake Superior. It's likely that divers may never personally visit the Fitzgerald. She's in some 500 feet of water, but they could easily reach the anchor in just 35 feet of water.
In fact, this is often what it's like when we're down here. Visibility way down.
The anchor was lost in January of 1974 and was pretty much forgotten until just recently.
We had the location, the basic location from the captain of the Fitzgerald, and this was located less than a quarter of a mile on the same line that the Fitzgerald would have been laying in. And we spent approximately 3 to 4 weeks out there looking for the anchor itself. And on our last dive of the last week, it did pay off.
Detroit weatherman Mel Sellers played a major role in raising the anchor. His interest in the subject started several years ago.
I was doing WJR at the time, and I remember the storm and the reports coming over. And I had seen it on the bottom the last few days, but when it came out on the end of the hook, my heart was just beating because it was just magnificent as it came up.
There it is. There's the shackle for the first time in 19 years. There is the 12,000-pound anchor from the Edmund Fitzgerald. Now they're going to bring it and put it.
The anchor was covered with zebra mussels, but easily cleaned up with a high-pressure water gun this morning. Divers then matched the ID numbers from the anchor to those of the anchor lost by the Fitzgerald in January of 1974.
There's all the numbers right here. Isn't that cool?
They matched perfectly. Now a permanent part of the Dawson Museum, the anchor will eventually get a cement platform to rest on, and will have a plaque in front displaying all the people who helped make the project possible.
It so happened that a year after this, my school took a class field trip across to Detroit and Belle Isle to visit the Dawson's Museum, and I got to see this mighty anchor in person, to touch it and even sit on it. As an 11-year-old boy, my fascination with the sea was cemented. It's the late 1950s and the auto industry is booming all along the Great Lakes, with the big three, Chrysler, Ford, and General Motors, all making a record number of cars. GM would make more than 13 million cars that decade. Ford would be a close second at 12 million. The cities that built the cars, like Detroit, couldn't get the materials to build the cars fast enough. The Great Lakes shipping industry responded to the need, and it's shipping record amounts of goods and other materials all over the place. And a new ship is being planned. Northwest Mutual Life Insurance Company of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, is heavily invested in shipping of things like minerals, iron ore, and they plan to build a ship like no other ship that we've seen before. At the same time, the St. Lawrence Seaway is planned to open in the next few years, and it's going to change the shipping industry on the Great Lakes forever. It will boom into something much, much bigger. So Northwest Mutual contracts the Great Lakes Engineering Works, company of River Rouge, Michigan, to build the new ship, but they have a few demands. The ship must be within 1 foot of the maximum size allowed in the St. Lawrence Seaway. They wanted to make sure that they're maximizing the amount that they could haul at any one time. The maximum length of the St. Lawrence Seaway would be 730 feet, so they ordered the ship to be 729, the longest ship on the Great Lakes ever. The new ship would be coal-fired when it was first built, which was sort of normal for the day, and she'd be able to carry a weight of some 26,000 long tons, mostly of ore. That was the plan, more than ever carried before on the Great Lakes. But it was a time that called for more than ever before be carried. The ship would be named for the then president of Northwest Mutual, Edmund Fitzgerald, whose own grandfather and all of his great uncles had been ship captains on the lakes, and his father had owned the Milwaukee dry docks that repaired ships. Fitzgerald actually didn't love the idea of the ship being named after him and had suggested other names like Centennial or Seaway or just the Milwaukee and Northwestern, but the board of directors wouldn't budge on the name. It was to be the Edmund Fitzgerald. The ship would launch on June 7th, 1958 to a crowd of some 15,000 people. This stuff was big back in the day, but problems cropped up immediately. As a sailor, I can confirm that we are a superstitious lot, and right out of the gate, things got weird. When Fitzgerald's wife, Elizabeth, tried to christen the ship by breaking the champagne bottle over her bow, it wouldn't break. And ships were launched at the time sideways down a slipway into the water, and when the crew tried to release the keel blocks that held her there, they wouldn't release. It took over half an hour to finally get the keel free and allow the mighty ship to start sliding. The ship careened down the ramp, and it hit the water so hard that she sent a huge wave over the spectators, but she didn't stop where she was supposed to. The massive inertia of this ship plowed across and slammed into the dock on the other side with such a huge crash, and it said one onlooker was so scared by it that he had a heart attack and died. Onlookers said the ship looked almost as if she was trying to climb right back out of the water when she was launched, and it would be some 3 months sitting at the dock getting her outfitted and getting things ready. But in September, the Big Fitz, as she became affectionately known, went out and completed 9 days of sea trials. Over the next 17 years, she would set records on the Great Lakes, records from the fastest runs from point to point, or the biggest haul on those runs. She would set a record, and then break her own record, and then break her own record again. And then she was repowered from the old coal-fire system to an oil-fired engine. The shipping industry on the Great Lakes doesn't run all year round. The Soo and Welland locks can't be operated when the water freezes in the winter, and ice on the lakes becomes too hazardous. And with the year winding down in November of 1975, Big Fitz would take her final journey. She's made the journey many times in her career. You pick up ore in Superior, Wisconsin, and drop it off on Zug Island at the steel mill in Detroit. The first hop of the journey is to cross all of Lake Superior, some 350 miles in open water, to the other end, the protection of Whitefish Bay. No matter what the mighty Lake Superior was doing, you could find safety by getting to the other end at Whitefish Bay behind the protection of Whitefish Point, and then safely make your way down to Lake Huron. And Big Fitz loaded down to capacity with 26,000 tons of iron ore set out from Superior around 2 p.m. on November 9th. The weather forecast on Superior was quite good when they left. There was a storm that was passing to the south of the lake, but 5 hours after leaving, the forecast had changed for the worse. Much worse. The storm was now going to come right over Superior and call for gale force winds. Gale force winds typically means winds above 35 or 40 knots, well within what that ship was capable of operating in, but erring on the side of caution, the captain changed course and steered north up toward the Canadian side of the lake to get some protection from those prevailing winds from the land, lessening the wind and the waves that the ship would have to deal with. By 1 a.m., the wind was over 50 knots and the waves were 10 feet, smashing on the sides of the ship. The Big Fitz trudged onward until 2:30 p.m. on day 2 of the storm, when she had to slow to a crawl because the rain had become snow and the visibility was that much reduced. An hour into that low visibility crawl, the captain radioed another lake freighter that was just 10 miles behind him, the Arthur M. Anderson, and his report was, "I have a fence rail down, 2 vents lost or damaged, and a list. I'm checking down. Will you stay with me till I get to Whitefish?" A list on a ship means it's leaning one way or another, and the biggest worry when you start listing is that it's caused by extra weight. And the only place to get extra weight at sea is from water, getting into the ship. And rule number 1 of sailing is keep the water out of the boat. For the next few hours, the Anderson and the Fitzgerald would stay in pretty close communication as the storm worsened. The Fitz would report back that her radar masts had been disabled by the wind, so she was flying almost blind with the limited visibility, And to make those matters worse, the lighthouse and radio navigation beacon on Whitefish Point that they use for navigation in the dark had gone dark itself due to a power failure. Captain McSorley had spent most of his life at sea, starting as a deckhand and eventually working his way up to ship's master. He had some 44 years of experience when he took over the Edmund Fitzgerald in 1982. That was his 9th time in command. In all his time on the Great Lakes, this would be the worst he had ever seen, as the massive waves broke over his decks. By 6:30 p.m. on day 2, the Anderson is rocked by 2 gigantic waves from astern, 35-foot towers of water, but the Anderson survives. But the waves were as powerful as those you'd find in an ocean cyclone, and now they're headed straight for the Edmund Fitzgerald, which we know already has a list. The waves may stand the stern of the Fitz up and push her bow down into the water, and if she's already taking on water causing the list, it may deal a crippling blow. The Anderson radioed the Fitz to check in and got the final message the Fitz would ever send: "We are holding our own." Storms on Lake Superior are fairly commonplace, and they can rage well beyond what ships of the day could handle. Some 40 years earlier, on the same day in November, was what was called the Big Storm of 1919, and it hit all 5 Great Lakes, turning them into cauldrons of rolling water that would last for 4 days. During that storm, some 13 ships were lost by sinking. Many more were washed ashore, claiming the lives of some 244 men. This storm was similar, with winds in excess of 50 knots, gusting to 75, wave heights in excess of 35 feet, and barely enough visibility to see to the end of the ship. The Anderson called out on the radio multiple times to the Edmund Fitzgerald, but received no reply. She herself was in great danger as she slowly made her way toward the safety of Whitefish Bay. But they noticed that as they followed near the path of where the Fitz should have been, that she was no longer on their radar. The Anderson called the Coast Guard to report the Fitz missing, and by 9 p.m. a search was launched. But the Coast Guard didn't have anything nearly as capable as a Great Lake freighter to go out and look, so they got back to the Anderson and asked her captain to leave the safety of Whitefish Bay, turn around, and go back out to look for the Fitz. The captain of the Anderson replied with a lot of hesitation, "Well, I'll go back and take a look, but God, I'm afraid I'm going to take a hell of a beating out there. I'll turn around and give her a whirl, but God, I don't know. I'll give it a try." He turned the massive Arthur M. Anderson around and headed back out into the storm, with his bow directly plowing into the massive seas. Slowly, they pushed out, and at great risk to themselves and their ship, they reached Whitefish Point, losing the protection of the land, exposing their ship to the whole of the Lake Superior storm. They pointed the bow north-northwest and straight into the waves and plowed forward very slowly, throwing massive towers of water up in front of them as they bashed through the waves. Visibility was 0. The U.S. and Canadian Coast Guards, not having the ships capable of weathering the storm, launched air rescue and started searching from above. The call went out for help, and another freighter that was anchored in Whitefish, the William Clay Ford, hoisted anchor and went out into the storm to help. Together, the Anderson and Ford crisscrossed the open waters of Lake Superior under the helicopters, and they all searched for 3 days in the roughest seas any of them had ever seen. All they found was a battered lifeboat from the Edmund Fitzgerald and some floating debris. The storm abated and the search continued. Bits of debris washed up on nearby shores, and the news headlines turned grim.
We searched for 3 days in probably the roughest seas I've ever been in my life, including the North Atlantic and hurricanes in the Gulf, because you got 3 different seas from 3 different directions. At one point, we rolled 51 degrees. It was a real quick snap roll, and my XO went flying across the bridge and was actually standing on the bulkhead, on the port bulkhead. If the door had been open to the port bridge wing, he'd have went right on over the side. It was really bad.
An air and sea search is continuing for possible survivors of the Edmund Fitzgerald, a 729-foot ore carrier, which apparently broke apart and sunk last night on Lake Superior. The ship and its 29-man crew vanished in a storm with 80-mile-an-hour winds and wave heights up to 25 feet. All that has been found is an oil slick and some debris.
4 days after what was now presumed a wreck, a U.S. Navy aircraft with magnetic detection equipment found her. Later, a Navy ship would come with sonar and confirm the findings. A remote-operated sub was launched to confirm what everyone already knew. All that was left was the mystery of why she went down in the first place. History is brought to you by patrons, people who give a couple of bucks an episode to make these videos possible. If you get some value from these videos or you want to help us make more, please consider becoming a patron. Patrons also get early access to videos, and they play a big role in the videos that we're going to make in the future, as well as participating in live events. The Coast Guard would do an exhaustive investigation, but their official findings would be argued by other sources. The captain of the Anderson particularly disagreed, as well as the captain of another freighter that was out sailing Superior that night. The Coast Guard report cited the clamps that hold the cargo hatches on these ships. The massive cargo holds on the ship are open at the top for loading and unloading, but they can't be left open because if water gets in there, it'll sink the ship. A massive hatch cover weighing tons, being lifted by a crane, is fitted over each hatch to keep the water out, and then clamps are fastened all around the hatch. And the Coast Guard reports that the clamps, and this is from them sending the submersible down to investigate, were not fastened properly or left loose. A lot of Great Lake captains argue this, including the captain of the Anderson, who was out there with the Fitzgerald at the same time. He worries the ship either bottomed out on a shoal, puncturing the hull, or it was caught between the two massive waves that the Anderson had felt earlier, and they drove the stern underwater and then the bow underwater. In the summer of 1995, a team would go down on one final mission before the Edmund Fitzgerald might be lost to history. They went down the 530 feet to the lake bed below, where the Edmund Fitzgerald lay, to recover the ship's bell. The bell would be used in a memorial that they were building at Whitefish Point to remember those who died there, but not to leave the Mighty Fitz without her bell. A new bell was installed in its place, and on it inscribed were the names of the 29 men who lost their lives in the worst shipwreck the Great Lakes would ever see. I hope that you enjoyed this video and share with me in remembering the loss of those 29 men, the heroics of the crew of the Arthur M. Anderson and the William Clay Ford, who set out into the wildest storm they'd ever seen to go and look for the Fitz, and the Canadian and American Coast Guard, who went out and continue to go out to this day in the worst the weather has to offer to save the lives of those who are lost at sea. If you enjoyed this video and would like to help me do my part to keep history alive, please consider subscribing to this channel and give the video a thumbs up, and please leave a comment below on what you would like to see next. This has been another History video, and I will see you next week.
On this very day, a low-pressure system formed in the southwestern portion of the United States. At about the same time,
on the 10th of November 1975,
Waves turn the minutes to hours.
729-foot ore carrier, which apparently broke apart and sunk last night on Lake Superior. The ship and its 29-man crew vanished in a storm.
The legend lives on from the Chippewa on down to the big lake they call Gitchagumi. The lake, it is said, never gives up her dead when the skies of November turn gloomy. With a load of iron ore, 26,000 tons more than the Edmund Fitzgerald weighed empty. That good ship and true was a bone to be chewed when the gales of November came early. The
ship was the pride of the American side, coming back from some mill in Wisconsin. As the big freighters go, it was bigger than most, with a crew and a captain well seasoned, concluding some terms with a couple of steel firms when they left fully loaded for Cleveland. And later that night when the ship's bell rang, would it be the North Wind they'd been sailing? The wind in the wires made a tattletale sound, and the waves broke over the railing. Every man knew as the captain knew, with the winds of November been stealing. The dawn came late and the breakfast had to wait, from the gales of November came slashing. When afternoon came, it was freezing rain, in the face of a hurricane west wind. Summertime came, the old country mom said, fellas, it's too rough to be here. At 7 p.m. the day the hatchway gave in, he said, fellas, it's been good to know ya. Captain wired in, he had water coming in, and the good shipping crew was left. Later that night when his lights were out of sight, came the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald.
Well, as soon as we got at 10 minutes after 7, the motor stream was 10 miles ahead and gave him a position because his radar was out. That said that he was holding his own and making out fine. His lights were all good. So that's the lesson that we had, and it's very simple that the Fitzgerald went down.
Does anyone know where the mother clock goes when the words turn lips around? The searchers all say they'd have made like they made if they put 15 more miles behind her. They might have split up or they might have capsized. They may have drove deep into the water. All that remains is the faces and the names of the wives and the sons and the daughters.
That's Fitzgerald. Standby one, let me get the Arthur Anderson on this frequency here so the rest of that reported seeing the Fitzgerald disappear from his radar screen and was the last
Lake Huron rolls superior sings in the rooms of her ice water mansion. Old Michigan steams like a young man dreams, the islands and bays of the sportsman. Farther below Lake Ontario takes in what Lake Erie can send. The iron boats go as the mariners all know, with the gales of November remembered.
Billy Holt from the U.S. Coast Guard base in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, says the vessel has been officially declared lost.
Well, the search is continuing. We have a number of marine vessels in the area assisting us in collecting debris. 2 life rafts and 2 lifeboats and a number of life jackets have been positively identified as coming from Fitzgerald. The Coast Guard cutter Naugatuck is currently in the area assisting in the collection of debris.
In a musty old hall in Detroit they prayed, in the maritime sailors' cathedral. Church bell chimed and it rang 29 times for each man on the Edmund Fitzgerald. Legend lives on from the Chippewa down of the big lake they call Gitchagoo. Superior, they said, never gives up the dead when the gales of November come early.
This episode of History Seed is brought to you by Peter Lauer. This week's news patron is going to tell you a story about a ship that wasn't just shipwrecked, a ship that was stolen, a ship that changed countries and changed names, a ship that was used to scam the insurance company twice, a ship that was shipwrecked again, a ship that was discovered sailing itself home in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean with no crew and no captain, full of its cargo and food, no soul aboard. This week on History Seed, the greatest ghost ship mystery of them all, the Mary Celeste. Before this ship was stolen, before it was shipwrecked multiple times, before it changed countries, even before it crashed into and sunk another ship in traffic, before it was even called the Mary Celeste, this ship got off to a pretty rocky start. Sailors are a superstitious people, and it's a wonder that this ship ever sailed at all. In the early 1800s, goods were shipping all over the world, and the Atlantic was regularly crisscrossed by wooden sailing ships going between Europe and Africa and North America. It was an amazing time for maritime navigation and seamanship, and a lot of these ships were built on the east coast of what would be Canada, in the Bay of Fundy. Coastal schooners sailed up and down the east coast of North America, moving goods and people. A man called Joshua Dewis was a shipbuilder in the area, and he was making his break away from the smaller schooners that he had been building to make a much bigger, a much vaster brigantine-rigged ship that he would use to cross the Atlantic. Dewis needed lumber for his new ship that he wanted to build, and he needed a lot of it. So he contacted Jacob and Isaac Spicer. These are two brothers who owned the woodland around a town called Spencer's Island. And the deal was, Dewis would give them 1/4 ownership of the boat if they supplied the lumber. Now, there was a ton of money to be made in the sailing and shipping industry at the time, so the Spicer brothers agreed to the deal pretty quickly, and the keel for the new Atlantic crossing ship was laid on the beach right there in Spencer's Island in 1860. And the site of this shipbuilding beach didn't even have a wood mill, so the trees were basically cut down, dragged out to the beach, and then shaped with axes and saws. When the ship was finished, it was some 99 feet long and 25 feet of beam, or 25 feet wide, and 198 tons in all. She would have 2 masts with a brigantine rig, which has square sails on the main mast, supported by lateen or gaff rig sails fore and aft of that. And the ship would be dubbed the Amazon. Finally completed and launched, the Amazon would be 75% owned by its builder, Joshua Dewis, and then 25% owned by the brothers that supplied the wood, Jacob and Isaac Spicer. And a captain needed to be hired to make the first voyage, which was a planned trip across the Atlantic, carrying local lumber to sell. The first leg was to sail the Amazon from where it launched at Spencer's Beach to 5 islands nearby to pick up that lumber. They hired a captain, a man called McClellan, who was actually already sick when they weighed anchor for the first time to get underway. He had thought that once they got out there, the sea air would relieve his symptoms, but just a few miles into the journey, he was so sick that the first mate turned the Amazon around and put back in at Spencer's Island, where the ship had been built. A few days later, McClellan died from pneumonia in the Spicer brothers' family home. His body was loaded back onto the Amazon, though, to be sailed to his hometown a few miles away, a place called Economy. So Captain McClellan was just newly married before all this, and when his new wife saw her husband's new ship approaching the town, didn't really
Service trucks coming.